because we knew there would be new problems, unknown problems, when we finally saw the books. And with trust in politics so low, I had to be honest with the British public when I was standing in the full sunlight of democracy. I owed it to them to promise only what we knew we could deliver. And yet, Congress, even in our worst fears, we didn't think it would be this bad.
Final warning. Brave MP sends final warning to Starmer to back down from the upcoming election. In a political landscape that often feels more scripted than sincere, moments of real candor and conviction are rare. Yet, during a recent session in the House of Commons, one member of Parliament stood out Sir Roger Gale. In a sharp and impassioned appeal, Gale called on the Prime Minister, through the Leader of the House, to take a stand on an increasingly urgent issue, the proliferation of solar farms on British agricultural land. "Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker," he began, calmly but firmly. Later today, the House will be debating the subject of solar farms, and I don't wish to preempt that debate. But the fact of the matter is that the building of solar farms on agricultural land is completely incompatible with the government's proposed policy on sustainable agriculture. That opening line, respectful yet unyielding, was more than a procedural nod. It was a signal of deep frustration, a warning that priorities are being misaligned, that decisions made in Whitehall may be undermining long-term national interests. In just a few words, Gale exposed a glaring contradiction: the government's simultaneous push for energy reform and agricultural sustainability may, in fact, be cannibalizing itself. What followed was a rare call to decisive action, not wrapped in the typical diplomatic language of party politics, but delivered with the tone of a man who has had enough of circular discussions and bureaucratic buck-passing. So, could the Leader of the House, in the privacy of the Cabinet room, have a quiet word with the Prime Minister and ask him to talk to the Energy Secretary and to the Agricultural Secretary and bang some heads together? It was a moment that drew a mix of chuckles, raised eyebrows, and, for some, applause, not because it was particularly dramatic or inflammatory, but because it was refreshingly direct. Gale wasn't asking for another working group, review paper, or non-binding recommendation. He was demanding action, clarity, cohesion. Leadership, the phrase, "bang some heads together," may not be parliamentary parlance, but it conveyed exactly what many in the chamber and across the country were thinking. How can a government claim to support sustainable agriculture while simultaneously allowing productive farmland to be covered in solar panels? The debate that Gale alluded to later that day would no doubt involve civil discussions and technical arguments. But the essence of the issue is simple. Britain's food security and energy goals must be pursued in harmony, not at the expense of one another. With global supply chains increasingly fragile and climate volatility threatening crop yields, the preservation of domestic agricultural land is not just sensible policy, it's a matter of national survival, the Leader of the House. In her response, acknowledged the tension but offered no real assurance. Well, as he says, we will be debating some of these issues later today, and there is a balance that needs to be struck. He's absolutely right about that. Meeting our energy needs, our energy security, getting bills down, and developing solar is absolutely key to that, while at the same time ensuring that agricultural land and our food security is also maintained. It was a textbook reply, carefully calibrated, diplomatically vague. Yes, there is a balance to strike. Yes, we need energy security. But where is the decisive leadership that Sir Roger Gale was calling for? Where is the clarity that the British public deserves? That's the problem. In Westminster, where compromise is often the currency of politics, true leadership sometimes gets diluted. Leaders hesitate to challenge each other directly, preferring instead to coordinate, to consult, to review the matter in due course. But issues like these don't always have the luxury of delay. The United Kingdom is in the midst of multiple crises: an energy crisis, a cost of living crisis, and a looming food security crisis. The push for renewable energy is understandable and even commendable, but it cannot come at the cost of bulldozing the very farmland that feeds the nation. It's not just about food. It's about rural livelihoods, landscapes, and the long-term health of the country. Replacing fields with industrial-scale solar arrays may tick boxes in a spreadsheet, but it erodes the spirit and sustainability of the countryside. What Gale understands, and what many other MPs appear to forget, is that policy coherence isn't just an abstract virtue. It's a necessity. When the left hand of government doesn't know, or worse, doesn't care what the right hand is doing, the public pays the price. In this case, that price could be irreversible. Once good farmland is covered in panels and concrete, it doesn't return to full productivity overnight. And while solar energy has an important role to play, it must be integrated thoughtfully on brownfield sites, on industrial roofs, in areas where its impact is minimal. Not on the green fields that supply our food. Sir Roger's intervention, short as it was, cut through the noise. It reminded the chamber, and indeed the public, that leadership means sometimes telling hard truths. That real courage lies not in towing the party line, but in challenging it when necessary. That banging some heads together isn't about aggression. It's about urgency. It's about getting people in a room and forcing them to reconcile conflicting policies with the reality on the ground. It's also worth noting that Gale's comment wasn't just a warning to ministers. Indirectly, it was a challenge to Keir Starmer and the opposition too. While Starmer wasn't the subject of Gale's direct address, the sentiment echoes beyond the ruling party. Opposition leaders often decry government inconsistency, but they too must articulate how they would manage the delicate balance between clean energy development and protecting the countryside. Vague promises and environmental platitudes won't suffice. The public wants to know where each party truly stands and how they'll act when values collide. In recent months, the issue of solar farms on agricultural land has been raised in communities across the UK, from Lincolnshire to Cornwall, from Kent to the Cotswolds. Farmers, rural residents, and environmentalists alike have voiced concern. The worry isn't just about aesthetics. It's about priorities. When did it become acceptable to sacrifice the nation's breadbasket for poorly planned green credentials? Energy. Companies, of course, are eyeing these lands with interest. They argue that large, flat spaces near existing grid infrastructure make farmland ideal for solar development. But whose interest does this serve? Surely not the farmers whose livelihoods are disrupted. Surely not the consumers who depend on locally grown produce. And certainly not the future generations who will inherit the consequences of today's decisions. Sir Roger Gale may not dominate headlines or trend on social media, but his voice in this moment carried weight because it embodied something politics needs more of: conviction over calculation. The real question now is, will anyone listen? Will the Prime Minister take the hint and call a meeting that actually results in a coherent, united policy direction? Will Keir Starmer use his platform to demand greater clarity and leadership from both sides? Or will this moment, this opportunity for course correction, be lost in the fog of procedural debate? The British public is watching. Rural communities are waiting. Farmers are anxious. The choice is clear. Either we protect our farmland and find smarter ways to meet our energy goals, or we risk undermining the very resilience we claim to build. One brave MP has thrown down the gauntlet. He has asked for heads to be banged for contradictions to be confronted, for leadership to rise above silence and speak plainly. Will those in power pick it up? Before leaving, we ask everyone reading this to consider the wider implications. Agriculture and energy are not isolated sectors. They are the foundation of national security. Without strong leadership, without urgent dialogue, without the political courage to bang heads together and make the hard decisions, we are not merely managing decline, we are accelerating it. Share this story. Talk about it. Demand answers from your elected officials. Ask them where they stand. And remember, the future of our land and our food is being decided right now, in rooms where too few are willing to speak as plainly as Sir Roger Gale. Let's not let his words echo into silence. Let them spark a national conversation and the political courage to do what's right. Sir Roger Gale's warning was more than a simple call for better coordination. It was a reflection of the growing disconnect between those in Westminster and the realities facing rural Britain. And while his appeal may have been brief, the weight behind it resonates with those who feel their concerns are too often sidelined in favor of short-term political wins or corporate interests disguised as progress. The context of his remark cannot be ignored. Solar energy, while vital to the UK's transition to a low-carbon future, has become a battleground between environmental ambition and practical sustainability. Government targets to reach net zero emissions by 2050 have created pressure to expand renewable infrastructure quickly. Unfortunately, that pressure often leads to hasty planning decisions, particularly in the case of solar farms. Gale's comments draw attention to this rush to the idea that in a blind pursuit of green metrics, we may be sacrificing the very foundations of sustainability, our soil, our food systems, and the families who work the land. He has done what few others in public office are willing to do: question the assumed wisdom of rapid, unchecked expansion and demand that it be reconciled with common sense, because this isn't about opposing solar. That's where Miliband is losing the battle, not because he lacks facts or vision, but because he's speaking a language that increasing numbers of people no longer relate to. He talks in long-term projections, global commitments, and emissions. Data. Reform talks about heating bills, lost jobs, and government overreach. One speaks policy. The other speaks pain, and that's why Miliband's plea to reform feels so ineffectual. Telling Farage and Tice to reconsider their net zero position isn't just futile, it's strategically tone-deaf. It ignores the fact that their opposition is not policy-driven. It's politically and culturally deliberate. For Reform, rejecting net zero is a way to draw a line between them and a political establishment they claim has ignored ordinary people for too long. Backtracking now would destroy the very brand they've built. This dynamic puts Miliband and Labour in a bind. Doubling down on net zero risks alienating working-class voters who see it as a financial threat. Backing off would risk revolt among younger, progressive voters who view climate policy as non-negotiable. The party can't afford to alienate either group, but it hasn't yet found a way to satisfy both. So far, Miliband's strategy has been to insist that the green transition will create jobs, boost the economy, and reduce long-term costs. And, in fairness, there's some truth to that. But these benefits are often abstract and long-term. What many voters want are concrete answers about the here and now: how to pay their bills, how to heat their homes, how to keep their car on the road without bankrupting themselves, until Labour can explain how net zero will work for them, not just in principle, but in practice. It will struggle to win this debate. Meanwhile, Reform's messaging machine is growing more confident. They know they're striking a nerve, and they're emboldened by international trends, from the backlash to Les in London to protests in Europe against green mandates, to the election of populist, climate-skeptical leaders abroad. All of it feeds their claim that net zero is a globalist con designed to punish the many for the sins of the few. Miliband might call that reckless. But it's effective, and so, while he tries to shame reform into changing their minds, they are busy convincing voters to change theirs. It's a high-stakes gamble that could reshape the UK's energy policy for a generation. If Miliband wants to turn the tide, he'll need to move beyond lectures and condemnation. He'll need to present a climate policy that isn't just idealistic, but realistic, one that doesn't feel like a moral crusade, but a practical roadmap. That means being honest about costs, flexible on methods, and deeply engaged with the people who've felt left behind, because the truth is, if net zero fails, it won't be because climate change isn't real. It will be because political leaders failed to bring the public with them, and right now, Ed Miliband is in danger of becoming the face of that failure, while reform is fast becoming the voice of those who feel left out of the conversation entirely. This growing divide isn't just about climate policy. It's a test of whether Britain's political class still knows how to listen. Ed Miliband, once seen as a visionary on green policy, now faces accusations of being out of touch. Critics say he's clinging to a net zero narrative that might resonate inside think tanks and university panels, but not in the kitchens and factories where people are worried about the next heating bill, not melting ice caps in 2100. That's not to say people don't care about the environment. Poll after poll shows widespread concern about climate change. But concern doesn't equal consent for policies that feel rushed, unfair, or economically lopsided. And this is where Miliband and Labour are struggling. They've failed to translate environmental ambition into real-world security for ordinary voters. Reform strategy takes full advantage of this. While Labour talks about building wind turbines and rewilding farmland, Reform talks about reclaiming control. Control over energy, over policy, over national destiny. It's a message that echoes the populist themes of Brexit, which still carry immense political weight, especially in the same communities that delivered the Leave vote. This is why Miliband's attack on Reform doesn't land. It's framed in moral panic, accusing them of climate denial, recklessness, even betrayal. But those labels don't scare voters the way they used to. In fact, they often backfire. To many Reform supporters, being called reckless by Miliband or the BBC is a badge of honor. It means they're challenging the very system they believe has failed them. And what's more, Reform is not just a protest movement anymore. It's an electoral force in the making. Local council results, by-election swings, and polling surges all suggest the party is becoming a viable option for millions of disaffected voters, especially those disillusioned with the Conservatives. But unwilling to embrace Labour. In that context, Miliband's warnings sound increasingly desperate. His appeal for Reform to change its stance assumes that this is still a debate based on facts and feasibility. But it's not. It's a political war over meaning, over identity, over who speaks for Britain's future. In that war, data doesn't matter as much as narrative, and Reform has found one that resonates. Still, Miliband isn't without tools. He remains one of Labour's most experienced operators, and if he adapts, he could still shape the narrative around net zero. But it will require humility. It will require shifting from top-down policy diktats to bottom-up engagement. It will require abandoning the assumption that the moral high ground is enough, because if Miliband and Labour fail to reframe net zero as a people-first project, not a technocratic mission, the policy will crumble under its own political weight. And Reform UK, with all its bluster and bluntness, will be standing over the wreckage, claiming victory, and what comes next if they do? A rollback of environmental